Inside the front pocket of a 4-year-old girl's overalls was an orange prescription bottle, washed clean, label peeled off, filled with 14 M&Ms. She carried it everywhere, to daycare, to the grocery store, to her grandmother's house on Saturdays, to the Family Feud studio in Atlanta on November 14, 2025, where she would unscrew the cap, pour 3 M&Ms into her mother's palm, and say, with absolute medical authority, "Take your medicine, Mama, you'll feel better." Her name was Ivy Monroe. She was 4 years old, 36 pounds, and she had been playing doctor to her mother since she was 2.5. Since the morning she watched her mother, Shayla Monroe, swallow 11 pills from 5 different bottles at the kitchen table and asked what they were for. And Shayla had said, "They're Mama's medicine, baby, they help me feel better." And Ivy had gone to her toy box, found a plastic Easter egg, filled it with M&Ms from the pantry, brought it back to the kitchen, and set it next to her mother's pills and said, "Now you have mine too." Shayla had laughed. Then she'd gone to the bathroom and cried so hard she bit her own hand to keep quiet. 14 months later, Ivy was standing on the Family Feud stage while Steve Harvey, during an unscripted audience warm-up, knelt in front of her and asked the question he'd asked hundreds of children over 23 years of hosting. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Ivy looked at Steve Harvey, reached into her pocket, pulled out the orange prescription bottle, held it up, and said 3 words. "My mama's medicine." Steve Harvey's legs folded beneath him. He went from kneeling to sitting on the stage floor without deciding to, the way a body sits when the mind has vacated the premises. He pressed the prescription bottle against his chest with one hand and covered his eyes with the other, and did not move or speak for 27 seconds. What happened in the next 3 hours would cost Steve Harvey $2.4 million, mobilize a medical network across 3 states, and generate the single most shared Family Feud clip in the show's history. But the moment that Steve has never spoken about publicly, the moment his producers said changed him permanently, happened backstage, in a hallway, between Steve and Ivy's grandmother. And it lasted 9 seconds and involved no words at all. It was a Friday in Atlanta, mid-November, the trees holding their last leaves in that reluctant way southern trees do, letting go one at a time like they're counting. The Monroe family had driven 8 hours from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, in a 2007 Chevrolet Impala, with a transmission that shuddered above 60 miles per hour, forcing Shayla's mother Lorene to drive the entire way at 58, which added 2 hours to the trip and tested the patience of every driver behind them on I-40. Shayla sat in the passenger seat with the seat reclined, because sitting upright for more than 30 minutes made her joints swell. Behind her were Lorene's sister Darlene and Shayla's cousin Terrell. Ivy sat in her car seat behind Lorene, the prescription bottle in one hand and a stuffed rabbit named Nurse in the other. Named by Ivy, who had decided at age 3 that her rabbit was a medical professional and treated the designation with the seriousness of a board certification. Across the bracket, the Whitfield family from Memphis, 4 siblings and their father, a retired bus driver named Earl, who wore suspenders and told everyone within earshot that he was going to win enough money to take his wife on a cruise. Were rehearsing answers near the green room with a competitive intensity that suggested the cruise was not optional. The Monroe family stood quietly near the entrance. Shayla was leaning against the wall. Lorene was watching Shayla lean against the wall. But nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen. Shayla Monroe had been diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus when she was 23 years old. The symptoms had started earlier. Fatigue she blamed on her 2 jobs, joint pain she attributed to the 12-hour shifts she worked stocking shelves at a distribution warehouse in Pine Bluff, a rash across her cheeks that she covered with foundation and ignored. She ignored everything because ignoring things was how Shayla Monroe survived. She'd grown up in a house where her father drank and her mother prayed, and neither activity solved the fundamental problem, which was that there was never enough money and never enough peace, and never enough space between the drinking and the praying for anyone to sit down and ask how the children were doing. Shayla left home at 18, got her GED, started working, and built a life the way people build lives when no one teaches them how. By trial and error, mostly error, held together by work ethic and the refusal to ask for help, because asking for help in Shayla's experience meant owing someone. And owing someone meant being controlled, and being controlled meant becoming her mother. And becoming her mother was the one thing Shayla had sworn at 14 she would never do. Then Ivy arrived. Ivy's father, a man named Curtis, was present for the conception and absent for everything else. Shayla didn't chase him, she didn't call. She did what she had always done. She worked. She worked through the pregnancy, through the delivery, through the first 6 months of Ivy's life, during which Shayla slept in 3-hour intervals and drove to the warehouse at 4 in the morning and loaded pallets until noon and drove home and fed Ivy and napped until Laureen arrived at 4 to take the evening shift, so Shayla could drive to her second job, cashiering at a Walgreens, until 10. The system was brutal and functional, and it worked until the lupus made it stop working. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. The disease came for Shayla in stages. First, the fatigue worsened. Not the normal tiredness of 2 jobs and a baby, but something deeper, something cellular. A heaviness that started in her bones and radiated outward until lifting a case of bottled water at the warehouse felt like lifting a car. Then the joint pain escalated. Her wrists, her knees, her fingers, swelling and stiffening until some mornings she couldn't close her hand around a doorknob and had to call Laureen to come open Ivy's baby food jars because Shayla's grip had become the grip of an 80-year-old woman at 24. Then the kidney involvement. The rheumatologist in Little Rock, the nearest city with a specialist accepting Medicaid, told Shayla her kidneys were inflamed and that without aggressive treatment, immunosuppressants, steroids, monthly monitoring, she could be facing dialysis within 3 years. Shayla sat in that office and heard the word dialysis, and what she actually heard was the word cost. Because every medical word in Shayla's vocabulary had a financial translation, and the translation was always the same: more than she had. The medications were expensive. Medicaid covered some. The copays for the rest added up to $340 a month, a number that doesn't sound catastrophic until you put it next to Shayla's income, which was $23,000 a year, which was the ceiling of what a woman with a GED and lupus could earn in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where the median household income was $28,000 and the poverty rate was 31%, and the nearest rheumatologist was 90 minutes away, and the nearest pharmacy that consistently stocked all 5 of her medications was 45 minutes in the other direction. Shayla made choices. She refilled 3 medications and skipped 2. She took the immunosuppressant every day, and the steroid every day, and skipped the anti-inflammatory and the blood pressure medication, because those were the most expensive, and because when you're choosing between pills and diapers, the diapers win every time. Her doctor told her skipping medications was dangerous. Shayla said she understood. She kept skipping them because understanding danger and being able to afford safety are not the same thing. By the time Ivy was 2, Shayla was functioning at maybe 60% of what her body had once been capable of. She'd lost the warehouse job, not fired, laid off during a restructuring, which was a polite word for the company deciding that a woman who called in sick twice a month was a liability. She'd kept the Walgreens job, part-time, 22 hours a week, standing behind a register on joints that screamed, smiling at customers with a face that was sometimes swollen from the lupus butterfly rash and sometimes swollen from the prednisone, and always performing the version of herself that the world required rather than the version that actually existed. Lorene moved in. This was not a choice but a surrender. Shayla's body had made a decision her pride wouldn't, and the decision was that she could no longer lift Ivy into a crib, could no longer stand long enough to give Ivy a bath, could no longer do the physical work of mothering without help. Lorene sold her own furniture, moved into Shayla's 2-bedroom apartment, and became the infrastructure that held the household upright. Cooking, cleaning, lifting, carrying, doing every task that required a body that worked, so that Shayla could save what remained of hers for the tasks that required a mother's presence, which were the ones that couldn't be delegated. The bedtime stories, the songs, the forehead kisses, the small daily rituals that told Ivy she was loved by the specific person who was supposed to love her. Ivy watched. Ivy always watched. She watched her mother swallow pills every morning in a ritual as fixed and solemn as prayer. 5 bottles lined up on the kitchen counter, each one opened and closed in the same order, each pill swallowed with the same sip of water, each bottle replaced in the same spot. She watched her mother's hands struggle with jar lids. She watched her mother sit down on the floor sometimes, not to play but because standing had become optional when her knees decided it was. She watched her mother nap at 2 in the afternoon, which other mothers didn't do, which Ivy noticed because Ivy noticed everything in the way that children whose parents are sick notice everything, with a vigilance that has no name and no off switch, and that lives in the body like a second heartbeat. The orange prescription bottle was Ivy's invention. She found it in the bathroom trash, empty, rinsed, label half peeled, and she washed it under the faucet and dried it with a towel and filled it with M&Ms from a bag Lorene kept in the pantry and brought it to Shayla and said, "Take your medicine, Mama." And Shayla had taken the M&Ms and eaten them and said, "I feel better already." And Ivy had nodded with the satisfied certainty of a doctor whose prescription has worked. And the game was born. Every day, every morning, Ivy administered the M&Ms. Shayla took them. And the exchange, a child's desperate need to fix the unfixable, meeting a mother's desperate need to let her child believe she could, became the architecture of their relationship, the ritual that held them together the way Lorene held the household together, through repetition, through faith, through the daily decision to act as if things were okay, even when the body and the bank account said otherwise. One night in August, Shayla had a flare so severe she couldn't get out of bed. Lorene was handling Ivy's dinner. Ivy walked into Shayla's bedroom carrying the orange bottle. Shayla was lying on her side, eyes open, breathing shallow, her wrists so swollen they looked like they belonged to someone else's body. Ivy unscrewed the cap, poured 3 M&Ms into her palm, and held them out. Shayla tried to lift her hand. She couldn't. Her fingers wouldn't close. Ivy stood there holding the M&Ms, watching her mother try and fail to take the medicine. And her face did something that Lorene, watching from the doorway, would later describe as the most painful thing she'd ever witnessed. It didn't crumble, it focused. It became the face of a child who understood, at 4 years old, that the game wasn't working, that the M&Ms weren't medicine. that her mother was sick in a way that candy couldn't fix. Ivy put the M&Ms back in the bottle. She set the bottle on the nightstand. She climbed into the bed, pulled the blanket over both of them and said, "I'll just stay then." Shayla wrapped her swollen arm around her daughter and pressed her face into Ivy's hair. And the sound she made was not crying. It was the sound a person makes when they realize their child has grown up faster than any child should, and the cause is them. The real story hadn't even started yet. The Family Feud application was Terrell's doing. Terrell was Shayla's cousin, 29, a paramedic in Little Rock who had watched Shayla deteriorate for 2 years and had been sending her money every month, $100 here, $200 there, whatever he could. And it was never enough, because the gap between what Shayla needed and what anyone in the family could provide was the width of a system that charged $340 a month for medications that cost $4 to manufacture. Terrell applied in secret. Lorene helped with the audition video. When the callback came, Terrell drove to Pine Bluff and told Shayla they'd been selected. Shayla said she couldn't go. Lorene said the van was gassed. Shayla said her joints couldn't take 8 hours in a car. Darlene said she'd brought cushions. Shayla said she didn't have the energy for television. Ivy, standing in the hallway holding the orange bottle, said, "Mama, maybe Steve Harvey has medicine too." The game was closer than anyone expected. The Whitfields were fast and funny. Earl's suspenders became a running bit with Steve, who kept threatening to snap them. And the Monroe family was slower, more cautious, with Terrell carrying the buzzer work and Lorene providing surprisingly sharp answers that she attributed to watching this show for 20 years and talking back to every contestant who got it wrong. Steve kept looking at Shayla. He noticed her hands, the swelling, the way she held the buzzer with her palm instead of her fingers, the way she winced when she pressed it. He noticed Ivy in the family section, sitting on Darlene's lap, holding the orange bottle. Steve noticed everything. He filed it. The Monroes won by 8 points. They made it to fast money. Shayla and Terrell played. Terrell went first and scored 134. Shayla needed 66. Steve read the questions. Shayla answered, slow, deliberate, each word measured the way she measured her energy, spending only what was necessary. The board flipped. 142, 159, 171, 183. Steve paused. The studio fell completely silent. The last answer appeared. 196, 4 points short. Shayla closed her eyes. She put both hands flat on the podium, not pressing, resting, letting the surface hold the weight her wrists couldn't. And she breathed. Terrell put his hand on her back. Lorene was rocking in her seat, lips moving in silent prayer. Ivy was watching from Darlene's lap with the particular stillness of a child who is adding this moment to the catalog of things she cannot fix. Then Steve did what Steve does between tapings. He walked to the family section. He saw Ivy. He knelt. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Ivy." "How old are you, Ivy?" 4 3/4. Steve smiled. The audience laughed. "What's in that bottle you're holding?" Ivy held up the prescription bottle. "Mama's medicine." Steve tilted his head. "Can I see?" Ivy handed it to him. Steve unscrewed the cap and looked inside at the M&Ms. He looked at Ivy. He looked at Shayla. Something crossed his face, fast, like a shadow passing over water. "You give these to your mama?" "Every morning, 3 pieces. She has to take them or she won't feel better." Steve's smile changed. The performance drained out of it. What remained was just a man kneeling in front of a child who had built an entire pharmacy out of chocolate and hope. He said softly, "Ivy, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Ivy looked at her mother. She looked at Steve. She held the bottle against her chest, the gesture Shayla made every morning with her own pills, unconscious, protective, the body language of a person holding the thing that keeps them alive. And she said 3 words. "My mama's medicine." Steve's legs gave. He went from kneeling to sitting, his body simply deciding that standing or kneeling were no longer structurally possible. And he sat on the stage floor with the orange bottle pressed against his chest and his other hand over his eyes, and he didn't move and didn't speak for 27 seconds. The audience was silent. Not quiet, silent, the airless silence of a room in which 200 people have simultaneously stopped performing the act of being an audience and have become, instead, 200 individual human beings, each processing the same unbearable sentence. A stagehand named Victor, 12 years with the show, set his headset on the floor and walked to the loading dock and stood outside in the November air and didn't come back for 10 minutes. The audio booth was muted. The control room was dark except for the monitors, and every face reflected in those monitors was wet. Shayla was standing at the podium, looking at her daughter, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has just heard the cost of her illness, measured not in dollars or pills, but in the vocabulary of her 4-year-old, who has internalized her mother's sickness so completely that when asked about her future, she doesn't see a future. She sees her mother, still sick, still needing her, and the only ambition she can imagine is the one she's already practicing every morning with M&Ms and a washed-out prescription bottle. Shayla's chin dropped to her chest, and her shoulders moved, and the sound that came out of her was so small and so deep that it seemed to come from somewhere below the floor. Steve lifted his head. He wiped his face with both hands. He looked at Ivy, who was watching him with concern. The automatic concern of a child who has been monitoring adults for illness and sadness for her entire life and has spotted both. She reached into the bottle, pulled out 3 M&Ms, and held them toward Steve. "You can have some too," she said. "You look like you need them." Steve took the M&Ms. He held them in his palm and stared at them, and pressed his fist against his mouth, and closed his eyes, and his shoulders shook once. Then he opened his eyes, ate the M&Ms one at a time, and said, "Thank you, Dr. Ivy." He looked at Shayla. He looked at Laureen. He looked at the prescription bottle in his hand. He stood up, walked to center stage, and pulled his earpiece out and dropped it on the floor. "Stop everything. Cancel the next taping." He walked to Shayla. He stood in front of her and he said 5 words. "She shouldn't have to be." The studio fell completely silent. Your daughter should want to be an astronaut, a teacher, a veterinarian, a princess, anything, everything. She should not want to be your medicine. And the fact that she does, the fact that a 4-year-old girl in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, has decided that the highest thing she can aspire to is keeping her mother alive, that's not beautiful. I know the internet's going to call it beautiful. I know the comments are going to say precious and adorable and faith in humanity restored. It's not. It's a child who has been drafted into a war she didn't start and can't win. And she's fighting it with M&Ms because the system that's supposed to fight it wants $340 a month that her mother doesn't have. Steve's voice was shaking. The audience was motionless. Let me tell you something. An old man at a gas station once looked at me at 2 in the morning. I had nothing. I was nobody. I was sleeping in my car. And he said, "God's got a plan bigger than your pain." And I have carried those words for 27 years. And right now, looking at that little girl, I believe those words more than I ever have. Because God's plan walked into this studio in overalls and a prescription bottle, and his plan is 4 years old and 3/4. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled his phone from his jacket, on stage, taping canceled. He called Dr. Vanessa Rhodes, the chief of rheumatology at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, live, on speaker. "I have a 30-year-old mother with systemic lupus. She's been skipping 2 of her 5 medications for over a year because she can't afford the co-pays. Her kidneys are involved. Her 4-year-old daughter carries a prescription bottle full of M&Ms because she thinks that's how medicine works. I need a full rheumatology workup. I need her on the correct protocol, and I need every medication covered. Today." Dr. Rhodes said yes. Full enrollment in the UAMS Lupus Specialty Clinic. Complete medication coverage through the hospital's indigent care program, and a dedicated nurse coordinator who would manage Shayla's care and eliminate the 90-minute drive to Little Rock by connecting her with a telemedicine program. The audience erupted. Lorene fell to her knees in the family section, hands clasped above her head, tears streaming, her mouth forming words that were prayer and gratitude and something older than both. Terrell was doubled over in his chair, his face in his hands. Darlene was holding Ivy, who was watching the screaming audience with wide eyes, and then looking at her mother, and then looking at Steve, and then looking at the prescription bottle, confused, not understanding why everyone was crying about candy.